Hello, my name is Sanda Maresca. I'm an artist living and working in a little town called Guerneville on the Russian River in Sonoma County, California. I've been a painter full-time for the last 8 or 9 years, but recently I've branched out and started exploring with fibers and polymer clays to make small sculptures that I call spirit totems. I generally make my sculptures of these animals, and I start with an idea, and then I just worked intuitively out of my knowledge of what the animal looks like with polymer clay. Sometimes I use porcelain clay, but because I don't have my own kiln, it's more convenient for me since I've discovered how to use the polymer clays, which I can then bake in my little toaster oven in my studio without having to invest in a full kiln. What I'm working on right now is the head of a larger sculpture. It's going to be a sheep. And as you can see, the polymer clay, I like working with it because it doesn't have to stay wet. You don't have to use water. And I'm able to use my collection of sculpting tools and form the animal's head in a way that will attach itself. The head and the feet need to attach themselves to a wire armature later. So what I need to do is make sure that I'm designing it so that it will support an armature and can be attached to it. And to do that, I create holes, which I will then fill with wire in the process of creating the armature. Once I formed the animal's head and feet, I then put it, this is a very primitive way to do it, I'm sure, but it's how I've managed to have success so far. I simply put it on a plate. I preheat my little toaster oven to the required temperature. I set my timer and I let it go. And with a bigger piece like this, I'm going to have to keep a very close eye on it because I have learned the hard way that if it bakes too long, it will crack, and if it doesn't bake long enough, then it's not hard enough when I put the wire armature in, it's likely to break. After I have put the armature in, this paint may chip off in places, but the nice thing about the process I have discovered is that I can always go back and touch it up later after the animal is already felted. And the nice thing about using acrylic paints rather than oils, which is what I usually use for my painting on canvas, is that the acrylic paint dries very quickly, and so I don't have to worry about waiting a long time between the color stages of what I'm painting. So as you can see in this case, I have another large sheep head that I'm working on. I might point out he was one of my experiments because I baked him too long. He was the biggest piece I had ever made, and I baked him too long and have a crack in his ear. But I'm going to try to repair that crack with more clay and see if that works. So as you can see, I am not working from any kind of an instruction or a class or a book or anything. I'm making it up as I go, and I'm using my intuitive spirit and the fact that I happen to love these animals, and hopefully my affection for them will come out in the finished piece. In this stage, which is the most difficult in my opinion, because it's the stage where it's most likely that the piece will break if it's going to break, or the stage at which the form won't be exactly right to support the final felting process. But what I'm doing here is I'm taking, it happens to be a rabbit who has been painted. The head and the feet have been formed of polymer clay and baked and then painted with acrylic paint. And now what you're seeing is I am putting the wire armature. I start with the head, and I happen to be using picture wire for this one, which I find is somewhat easier to work with because it's softer and less likely to break on a small piece like this. I tend to work in two halves so that I can, if at all possible, get the symmetry right. And the goal of the armature is to give a structure that is sturdy enough with the finished product so the product can actually invite someone holding it. It's not necessarily meant to be displayed all the time in a stand, although that is certainly possible. But they're almost like adult toys. That's why I call them spirit totems, because when I finish with them, and I'm never quite sure how it's going to end up when I am finished, once I'm finished, each one has a life of its own and a spirit of its own, as you will see when I show you some of the finished products. The next to the last stage of my little spirit totems requires taking my armature wrapped as it is with pipe cleaner, and then I use a material that is created out of the same wool batting that is used in quilting, which I order in bulk, and then I create, with a special way of cutting, I create this as strips. And it has sort of a tactile feeling to it so that it sticks to itself fairly easily. So I've discovered that I have to wrap the places where the clay meets armature, I have to wrap fairly tightly to keep the armature from showing through on the finished product. And I just keep working with it over and over. This is where I form the shape that the body will finally have. And that's why when you see my finished product, some of the animals are quite heavy, chunky and plump, and others are quite long and slender. And I find I vary that so that I create different personalities. Of the finished product will have a different personality each time, depending on how much of this batting I have used. After this stage, it's very difficult to change the form the animal is going to have. So I have to be pretty careful on this stage to make the shape basically what I would like the finished product to be. Eventually, I will come out with the full form of an animal that is ready to be needle felted, which is the final stage, as I'm going to show you next. And actually one of the most fun, I think, is the process of needle felting, which involves taking unspun fibers, and in this case I have cat fur, and in this case I have wool, lamb's wool that's been dyed, and I will attach it to my armature with this needle, which is a special felting needle with barbs on it that you can't see. But when I'm using the cat fur, and I happen to right now, I've been experimenting with different animal fibers, and so far my cat, Topaz, who's a Norwegian forest cat with a very thick, luxurious undercoat, which comes out at the rate of a bag a week in the summertime when my husband brushes her. This has been sitting in a bag for a while, so it's slightly matted. So what I need to do to get the fibers all going in the same direction is I need to card it. And I use the same tools that are used by spinners and weavers when they're going to spin their own yarn. In fact, she just arrived on the scene, probably knowing what I was going to be doing here. This was not planned. So what I do is I take her fur, which is matted at this point, and then I get all the fibers going in the same direction by using these special brushes called carders to get all of my fiber so it's facing in the same direction, or rather the two brushes, and then lightly carding them so that the teeth on the brushes make the fibers all go in the same direction. So when I take it off very carefully, I will then have what they call roving, which is unspun fibers. Finally, we're ready to apply the animal fibers, whether it's wool or cat hair or dog hair, which I've sometimes used. It's time to apply it to the body of the animal wrapped in roving. I'm wrapped in the wool batting. So as you can see on this one, it's partially already felted, but I have a piece here on the neck that I need to add some more structure to. And I do that, it's difficult to see because this needle is very dangerous, very sharp, and it has tiny barbs in it, which when pushed in to the fibers, causes the fibers to adhere to each other. So there's no need to apply any kind of glue or sewing or anything else. The animal, the finished sculpture or spirit totem, will be coated with this fiber, and it's very sturdy, and it's easy to do, except, like I say, it can be dangerous because if you get your finger underneath where this needle is poking in, it really hurts. The needles are also very easy to break, and you don't want one to break off in the body of the animal because then you have a danger situation with somebody accidentally getting a fingernail or something. So this stage I have to be very careful and very alert, but as you can see, this is just fiber that is laid over the wool batting underneath and poked into place with the needle to cause the final surface to be flat and soft and durable. Now this animal happens to be made partially out of lamb's wool, which has been dyed pink, and the pink parts of the cow, it's a cow, and her pink parts are lamb's wool that has been dyed, and the brown parts, or beige taupe parts rather, are my cat Topaz, which I have had great success with because her fur is extremely soft and extremely easy to work with. I'm also going to show you what it's like when you use regular wool, and I buy this already dyed, but some artists like to dye their own wool. I tear off pieces of it. This is sold as roving, as I said before. It's the wool that's been carded, but it hasn't yet been spun into yarn. And I lay it on the animal. This happens to be a lizard with a tail. It's the first one I've done with a tail. His head is made out of porcelain. His feet and tail are made out of polymer clay. But it's the same process. You can see I'm taking this needle, and I can add as many layers as I want to make him as fat as I want. But the main objective is to make sure that none of the wool batting, the white wool batting, shows through underneath. And also to make sure that wherever the clay is attached, that there's enough of the wool or other fiber, colored fiber, so that it doesn't show the holes in the armature. My particular final touch that I put on the majority of my pieces is I have these tiny heart buttons which I purchased, and I sew them on appropriately because for me these creatures all have spirit, and I want to make sure that whoever purchases them understands that they have a spirit of their own, including a heart. And because my birthday is on Valentine's Day, I use a lot of hearts in my art anyway.